We are honored to be partnering with an incredible list of co-sponsors this evening. We're grateful for their support for the book launch and also for the many years of work that they've been doing to imagine and fight for a healthier and more just world. We're putting links to these organizations in chat so you can learn more about the vital work that they are doing. And those include 350 Seattle, 350 Vermont, Alaska Institute for Justice, Beyond Toxics, Center for Humans and Nature, Coalition to Protect New York, the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, Post Carbon Institute, Protect the Bush Alliance, Rogue Climate, and finally the School of Law at Queensland University and Technology. I'd also like to really give special thanks to Oregon State University Press for publishing this really incredible and powerful and beautiful book. And thanks to our local bookstore, Grassroots Books and Music, for co-sponsoring this evening as well. So 4 years ago, the Spring Creek Project co-hosted an international tribunal that found that fracking and climate change unequivocally violate human rights. Now we're hosting 2 events to really amplify those stories that were told during the historical tribunal and to answer this paradigm shifting question. How is the world's view of fracking and climate change transformed when they are seen through the lens of human rights? Tonight's book launch is the first event in the series, and I'd also like to invite you to attend the premiere of the 30-minute documentary Bedrock Rights, a new foundation for global action against fracking and climate change, on June 2nd. We are including a link to register for the premiere in chat. After the screening of the film, we are going to host a celebration and conversation with the film's collaborators and with prominent thought leaders who are working to protect human rights and really secure a future for all. I'm so excited to be launching a book that tells the story of that tribunal and the eyewitness testimony, legal and moral arguments, and the advisory opinion of the tribunal. So we believe that this offers an important narrative to reveal fracking and climate change as instances of environmental justice. So I'm going to hand it over to the co-editors of the book, Tom Kerns and Kathleen Dean Moore. Tom Kerns is the co-drafter of the Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change and the director of the Environment and Human Rights Advisory. He's a professor emeritus of philosophy at North Seattle College and the author of Environmentally Induced Illness, Risk Assessment and Human Rights. He has lectured at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva on human rights issues. He serves as a board member of Beyond Toxics and of Concerned Citizens for Clean Air. He also served on the steering group for the Permanent Peoples Tribunal session on human rights, fracking, and climate change. So I'm welcoming Tom and also welcoming co-editor Kathleen Dean Moore. She served as a distinguished professor of environmental philosophy at Oregon State University, and now she writes and speaks full-time about climate and the extinction crisis and the moral urgency of action. Her books include Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, and Great Tide Rising Toward Moral Clarity in a Time of Planetary Change. And so Tom and Kathy, we are really honored to have you here this evening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to both of you.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you all the people who have tuned in. It's a great, great honor to have you here. What Tom and I thought we would do to start out seemed to be sensible, and that is to lay out the argument of the book and use that as a kind of a foundation for our discussion that follows with some extraordinarily interesting and well-informed people, both legal and activist leaders. So let me lay out the central argument of the book. Premise 1. Forgive me, Tom and I are both philosophers and we sometimes like to talk in syllogisms. So premise 1. Climate change will create the greatest violation of human rights the world has ever seen. Fracking, for its part, violates human rights in 2 ways. First, by fueling the climate change we face, but second, more directly, by damaging people's health, poisoning their water, and driving them from their homes. Premise 2, governments, which are established to protect the rights of the citizens, spectacularly fail to do that. And not only that, the governments are complicit in the rights violations, colluding with the fossil fuel industries to violate the rights of their own, often most vulnerable citizens. Conclusion, governments should be called to account by national and international courts. They should be compelled to put in place solid human rights protections, and solid fossil fuel industries should be held to those standards. So how's that for an argument? But Tom and I didn't just make this up. For the first time in history, an international human rights court has weighed the evidence that fracking and climate change systematically violate human rights. And what we've done is we have taken the eyewitness testimony, the moral and the legal arguments, and the opinion of the court itself, and put them together into this book, Bearing Witness. So Tom, you were there at the very beginning of this whole process. Will you tell us about the tribunal, what it is, what you brought to them, what they gave to us?
Yeah, thank you. You did a great job with those premises and conclusion. Well, the seed for this thing was planted at a conference that Anna Greer organized in Oñate, Spain in about 2011 or 12. And then she and I, Anna, by the way, teaches legal theory. So she's not a formal philosopher, Kathy, but she's a legal theorist. So she's on our team here. Then she and I began to put this brand new idea together. And the thing that strikes me about any new ideas is that new ideas are combinations of previous ideas that often come from different fields, and they're different in lots of ways, and they need to be rethought and re-put together. And so that some of the main previous ideas that went into this one are that fracking is a problem. We didn't know that fracking should be connected to climate change for very long before 2014, when our thinking and planning for this tribunal started. Fracking was still, clean natural gas, bridge fuel, that kind of thing. So fracking and climate change got put together, along with human rights. That got put together with those two things. And then all that was put together with this unique idea of a civil society human rights court, Permanent People's Tribunal, that had been around for 40 years or so. And then another old idea that got put into this new collection was the idea of human rights impact assessments, which itself was a new idea from a previous environmental impact assessment idea. The idea being that you have to lay out the impacts on human rights from a project that's being planned. And then another old piece that got put into this new idea was just before COP21 in Paris. Anna and I looked around to see if there were any treaties or declarations or conventions of any sort on human rights and climate change, and there weren't any. So we, with a group of other scholars, drafted a declaration on human rights and climate change. We sent it around to people all over the world in 7 or 8 different European and African languages, and got back lots of feedback. So that idea got put into the tribunal. The idea of amicus briefs from World of Law, the idea that a court could issue, the Permanent People's Tribunal in the past had always issued verdicts about a specific situation. They had never been asked to come up with an advisory opinion, which would be applicable all over the world. So those ideas all got put together, along with the idea of pre-tribunals, along with the idea of that what the court would decide in this case would affect literally every living being on Earth. And then we did it by Zoom. And this was in, the before times when nobody'd heard of Zoom before. And so we did it online. We could have attorneys and judges and witnesses from all over the world. So now, like with any new idea, that all those things could come together in one clump now seems obvious. Wasn't obvious at the time. But so that's kind of the overall picture of it. I'm curious, when you look back over it, and when we were going through all that testimony and all those reports and documents, what kind of things stood out for you, and what kind of rights that struck you as being particularly undermined in?
Yeah, when we started reading the eyewitness accounts of what was happening out in the field on the ground, and when we started to really read the very tough language in the advisory opinion, it was immediately clear that we're talking about the very most basic rights that are protected, presumably guaranteed by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to security of person. So the right to life, the world has seen starvation and plague and genocide, terrible widespread evils, but they pale compared to climate change. Climate change is a different sort of thing because it undermines the very systems that sustain the minimal conditions for human life. So now we're talking about rights to things like food and water and health, shelter, development, and yes, life. And when you talk about security of person, good Lord, already 20 million people have been driven from their homes because of the 3 impacts of climate change: sea level rise, just this, extreme weather events, and drought and water scarcity. 20 million so far, which is more during that last 10 years than war and political repression combined. And estimates are that by 2050, 150 million people will be displaced from their homes by climate change. And these are the poorest of the world's poor, who have, of course, done nothing to deserve this. So what is security of person when you've lost even your home? And when you think about the rights that are violated by fracking, think about what fracking does, okay? So fracking seizes your land or buys it at a submarket rate. It takes your fresh water. It mixes your fresh water with 650 chemicals. It injects that under force to blow up the rock, causing earthquakes. That brings up the gas and the oil that is by now mixed with even more toxins. They separate everything out. They release or capture or flare off the methane. They store the poisoned water in reservoirs or pump it back in to the rock towards the aquifers. And then they put the oil in pipelines and they send that across public or tribal land in pipelines that blow up 378 times a year on average over the last 10 years. So does anybody believe that you can do that while you're still respecting people's rights to health and clean water, private property, and self-determination? I think we have evidence that cannot be done. And in fact, that's one of the things that the judges said. It's simply impossible to frack and respect human rights at the same time. So I'm getting ahead of the story though, Tom. So let's talk more about the book. Not so much the book's argument, but the book itself. Will you talk about that process where we took all the information, all this material from the trial and put it together into this volume that we've seen the cover of?
Right. Well, I remember how it began.
Okay.
It was on the last day of the tribunal, Friday. The whole session had ended at noon. And you and I and Frank were sitting around your dining room table having lunch. And we just finished, and we were clearing off the table, taking it into the plates into the kitchen. And you offhandedly said, "Do you know if anyone's writing a book on this?" And I said, innocently, "Not that I know of." And you said, "Well, why don't we do it?" And so over the next half an hour before I took off to drive back to the coast, we talked out a few things and made a rough plan how to do it. And then on my drive home, I thought to myself, wow, I get to work on a book with Kathleen Dean Moore.
Jeez.
So, and then you and Frank took off for your Alaskan adventures, as you do every year. And when you came back, you and I and Emily Grubby met for 3 or 4 days at Shot Pouch Cabin out in the Coast Range Mountains here in Oregon. And we brought 3 main things. We brought a ton of documentation, evidence, testimony, reports, briefs, etc. And we brought our laptops, and we brought a big roll of butcher paper, and spent the next 3 days scribbling and imagining what we could do, how we could, like a mosaic artist, pick out pieces from this to make a really good contribution. And I think we mostly laid out the structure, the bones of the book. And when I look at our table of contents today, I think it's beautiful, frankly. I think it's just a really nicely laid out structure, a simple structure. We simplified a very complex thing. So
I think sometimes tables of contents are poems when they're
Are
done right.
poems?
They're poetry when they're done right. But tell people about Emily and tell them about Emma, because before we move on, we really need to hear about those wonderful people who are
Yes.
helping.
Yes. Well, first we have to thank Carly and Shelley, who are running this thing. They ran the tribunal, and it was, to me, astonishing, the smoothness and masterful way that they pulled that off. And that was the groundwork for this book. And then when the 3 of us met out there, you and Emily and I was so impressed with Emily's contribution, and I just want to underscore again our gratitude. So Emily, if you're out there listening, your contributions to this book are enormous in your research and helping us structure it and put it together and edit it over and over. Your influence is on every page. And Emma, if you're out there listening, your ability to bring it all together in some kind of organized way and put it into one piece toward the end made a huge difference. So that's kind of the beginning of how it was. But I mean, another question worth asking is, why did we make this book? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm going to keep this short because we're already running way over time, and I really want to hear from our guests. But let's just point out that we think that this book offers a new narrative, and it's a powerful new way to push back against fracking and climate change. And the arguments to appeal to knowledge and appeal to self-interest and appeal to nature, they just haven't worked out so well. But this, I think, has some promise. 10 years ago, and the other reason why we wanted to do this book was because this was something new. 10 years ago, my colleagues and I asked 100 of the world's moral leaders why we should protect the planet from fossil fuel. We got back 86 responses from some of the most brilliant environmental ethicists around the world. Not one of them mentioned human rights. So when you brought this idea forward, Tom, I thought this is something that we really, really should jump on. And it's really good timing too, because this is the time when we see the movement towards environmental justice and the movement towards climate action coming together in this very beautiful and powerful stream. So we wanted people to know about this new approach to putting limits on fracking and climate change. So let's move on and let's talk first about procedural rights. We'll get to substantive rights, but let's talk about procedural rights. And I'd love to bring on my dear friend, David James Duncan, coming to us from Missoula. I'm going to ask David to read some of the text from the advisory opinion about procedural rights. And I think it's important for everybody to know that the words he's reading have been edited, cut, and spliced in the interest of brevity, and they come straight from the advisory opinion. So David, hi, David. David is the author with David is the author with Rick Bass of a wonderful book called The Heart of the Monster. It's a protest of the plan by oil corporations and politicians to turn the Northern Rockies, rivers, roads, and wilderness into, as he says, a tentacle of the largest and most destructive petroleum project in history, the Alberta tar sands. That essay, parts of his essay are in Bearing Witness. So David, will you read to us from the advisory opinion?
I will. Thank you very much for having me. Around the world today, the activities of extractivist industries abound with serious violations of human and nature's rights. It was made clear in case studies presented to the tribunal that there exists an axis of betrayal between corporations and governments that allows the violations we describe in the tribunal's conclusions. A troublingly universal process occurs within government agencies designated to enforce legislation, whereby they fail to perform their regulatory function. For fracking to exist, strategies for cheating, undermining, and expropriating affected communities are coordinated in a cost-effective way across large land areas. The technical requirements for mass ruthlessness throughout the fracking frontier creates incentives for the development and maintenance of powerful institutions that control thought and possible action. Secrecy of operations enables the deadly large-scale experiments in poisoning humans and non-humans that the fracking industry is in violation of the Nuremberg Code. Gag orders, non-disclosure agreements, and strategic lawsuits against public participation are routine throughout the fracking industry. Less formal means of biasing public discussion include physical intimidation, censorship of information presented by fracking critics, false advertising, deliberate failure to investigate complaints, and the manipulation of those procedures for public participation that are still required by law. Resistance and open protest then generate new waves of rights violations. In this case, civil and political rights to liberty and security, to a fair trial, and to freedom of association, of expression, and of assembly.
Well, let's thank you very much, David. Those are strong words. Let's bring in Teresa Mills, who is an eyewitness to these violations. She is a grassroots organizer from Ohio, and she works with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. So, Teresa, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Let me ask you first. I mean, is that right? Is that true? And how does that mesh with your experience?
That is absolutely true, and everything that has been said in that decision. We live every day in Ohio, as most other states with the extraction industry also live. So yes, there are human rights violations beyond belief out there.
So you wrote in your piece for the book, or in your testimony, which we have included in the book, you wrote, "Our citizens are denied access to information. They have to go through armed guards with dogs to go to a public meeting." Tell us just draw a scenario of what that's like to try to testify in a fracking case.
Okay. Well, this was a very strange thing, just unbelievable. In Ohio, we are not allowed to have any public hearings on injection wells or on fracking. You know, you don't know that these are coming into your neighborhood until you see the land being ravaged or a rig shows up in your neighborhood. So there was a facility that wanted to put 7 injection wells in Portage County, Ohio. And they were able to get what they thought was going to be a public hearing, but it was just a public information. They held it in at a state park with all of the state workers that were there, and they were the ones that had the armed guards. They had the dogs. They also checked people's purses, and we're talking about citizens that there was no one under the age of 65. Okay, you had people going in there with walkers, you had the gray-haired grannies, and to expose those citizens to the fear that they felt walking through armed guards and, you know, guard dogs it's not only a human right, but it is so insulting to our citizens. So yeah, I just get so angry and so upset when I talk about that. We just recently reheard that story because we are doing some other things in Ohio where we are gathering more testimony on what's going on.
So what's the deal about the dogs? What purpose did the dogs have?
It was an intimidation tactic. That's all it was. I mean, why would state park rangers need guard dogs? And that's where it was. It was in a state park. So it was purely, there was no other excuse for it other than intimidation, pure intimidation.
The one of the things that you were talking about in your testimony had to do with how the fracking companies come in and basically gain control of the government. They can do things that make the government do what they want. And so you've witnessed what David read to us about an axis of betrayal where the federal government or the local government and the fracking industry are working in collusion. Yeah. So how do the fracking companies get the communities to do what they want when what they want is so clearly against the community's interest?
Right. Well, it's money. You know, money talks. And when a fracking company comes into a small town, and like in one area, excuse me, in Torch, Ohio, they came in and gave the local fire department money to help rebuild their fire station. I'm so sorry. So it's they've been given trucks. You know, it's money. It's just money. That's how they gain control.
So they might offer the community a police car or a truck, and you also mentioned a crime dog that they offer these right. gifts. But what's your metaphor for that? These gifts that are offered?
Well, it's my metaphor for a lot of this is when they come into a community and offer, you know, this little bit of money, I always say it's like dangling a radioactive carrot in front of a hungry rabbit and expect it not to eat. You know, it's ridiculous. And, you know, communities are being used, they're being abused, all in the name of, excuse me, of progress. And this is so far from progress.
All in the name of progress, so that the communities want this development or to become economically progressive, I guess.
Right. And, well, and they also say it's jobs.
Is it?
And, you know, I think our citizens deserve a lot better than the oil and gas extraction industry jobs.
Well, I really, so what you're talking about now are procedural rights, rights to information, right to participation, right to freedom of speech, the ones that David listed. Tom, join us for just a minute, will you, to talk about the difference between procedural rights and substantive rights, so we can see what Teresa's been talking about?
Yeah, it's pretty simple, really. The substantive rights are rights like the right to life, the right to health, the right to water, the right to things you need, basically, to live a minimally decent life. Those are substantive rights. And then the procedural rights are rights to the procedures that protect those substantive rights, you know, right to participation, right to information, right to engagement in decision-making, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and what Teresa is telling us is that it's very, very difficult for people to protect their substantive rights when their procedural rights are so dramatically curtailed.
Yeah, a
They
lot of the
can't get the
people
information.
the people who testified from Australia made a big deal about procedural rights because that's the main thing they're focusing on there. So.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Well, then, since you've just brought up this notion of substantive rights, let's turn now to that subject of substantive rights, and let's welcome Emily Johnston. Emily is a poet and an activist. If you could bring her on, perhaps, Shelley. Emily is a poet and an activist who's really beloved among the climate concerned people as one of the valve turners who faced felony charges for cutting the chains and turning the big wheels that temporarily shut down all the oil pipelines that are entering the United States from Canada. Welcome, Emily. We're honored to have you with us. It's a great honor.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here.
And we've asked Emily if she would read from the advisory opinion the words of the judges on substantive rights.
The profound nature of the core rights at stake, the rights to life, to respect for home and private life, to the peaceful enjoyment of possessions, in combination with the existing evidence of extremely deleterious health impacts of fracking around the world, suggests the urgency of considering human rights properly before the dash for gas produces serious and irreversible health, human, and environmental impacts. One of the ways in which fracking affects the entire Earth community to which humans belong is through its contribution to climate change. Fracking is an important component of the growing threats to global agriculture, ocean and coastal ecosystems, and human and non-human health and welfare that stem from global warming. The system of frontier law supporting extreme oil and gas extraction is underpinned, accompanied, and permeated by racism and colonialism. On one side are red and black communities, whether in Alaska, North Carolina, or Australia, whose ways of interacting with land are legally disvalued and whose history is ignored. On the other side is the white energy that their expropriation and oppression make possible. It could be thought irrational to allow an industry that is unnecessary, known to not be sustainable for the long term, and inherently abusive of human and nature's rights to continue operating. Especially is it irrational and most potentially catastrophic when we consider its inevitable significant contribution to climate change at a time when there is an urgent necessity to adopt policies that will save the planet.
You know, thank you. As I was listening to you read that, I was wondering whether when you read this for the first time, you said to yourself, that's why I turned the valves. This echo the sorts of things you were saying to one another?
It certainly resonates, you know, and in particular, I guess I would say the bit at the end of just about how irrational and unnecessary it is. And at this moment in time, right? It just, so many things are like that now.
Yeah, a really, really good point. Thank you so much, Emily. And now to give an example of the sorts of things we're talking about, we've asked Robin Bronen to come in from Alaska. Tom, will you introduce her?
Yeah. You here, Robin? Yes. Good to see you again. And you work, well, let me say who you are. Robin is the director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. She's a human rights attorney. who's been working since 2007, I think, with communities that have in Alaska been forced to relocate because of climate change. I think the term you use, Robin, is climate forced movement, climate forced. Anyhow, your testimony at the tribunal was very powerful, and it's included in bearing witness now too. So would you mind giving us an example or two of the kind of impact that climate change is having on basic minimal substantive rights requirements among Indigenous peoples in Alaska?
Yes, well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this really important event and in the work of the tribunal in the book. And so many of you may know that the Arctic is warming more than twice than the lower latitudes. And I say that because, for those of you who are familiar with the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC, globally, governments are trying to make sure that we do not reach above a aspirationally 1.5 degrees Celsius increase 2 degrees Celsius at the extreme. And I think it's really, really important for people to know that in the Arctic, we are far above those temperatures. And during the winter time, our temperature increases can be as much as 5 degrees Celsius above the norm. And I mention that because it is having a profound impact on ice. We are losing ice, the air conditioning unit on the planet. And Arctic sea ice, not only is that air conditioning unit, but in the wintertime, it normally should be traveling south from the Arctic Ocean along the western coast of Alaska. And Arctic sea ice is the protective barrier from giant storms that come in. We don't have hurricanes yet in Alaska, but we have hurricane strength winds. And without that Arctic sea ice combined with thawing permafrost, because as I mentioned, the temperatures are causing permafrost to thaw, we're getting accelerated rates of erosion. And through our work with Indigenous tribes, we identified a hazard in Alaska called USTEQ, USTEQ, and it means catastrophic land collapse. It's a Yupik word. And USTEQ is causing tribes along the coast to make the awful decision about whether or not they can stay in their ancestral lands, because it is not possible to maintain the integrity of the infrastructure that they have in their communities, like water, if they do have running water, water and sewage infrastructure and electricity. And most importantly, it's affecting their right to life because there are no evacuation routes in Western Alaska when these storms come in. And so several communities have made the decision to relocate, and they are making this decision to relocate to stay connected to their ancestral lands because they rely on those lands for the foods that they harvest and eat.
Yeah. Climate forced displacement, is that the term you use?
Yes, there's no actual, I would say, agreed upon terminology. And climate forced displacement is definitely one of the words that people use to talk about this horrific loss of home and the places that people love.
Yeah. And modes of transportation. I mean, if the mode of transportation is to move across the ice on sleds or snow machines, that's at risk too. Is that true?
Yes, well, people are dying because of unsafe ice. And, we used to have, winters where temperatures would stay solidly below freezing. So the ice was stable and strong. And now our winters fluctuate. So in Western Alaska, for instance, this past winter, it snowed and then it rained and then it snowed and it rained, and that creates great instability on the ice of the rivers that people use to be mobile and be able to travel to other villages.
Yeah. And some of the photos you've shown us of communities that are right along the ocean or where the ice used to be, but isn't there anymore. So they suffer horrible impacts from storms, buildings tipping into the ocean, that kind of thing. So you're a human rights attorney, how do you picture human rights being able to be of benefit in this situation? How can it help?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So first, I think it's really important for people to understand that in the United States, but it's not just the United States, it's really all over the world, we have a horrific legacy of governments forcing people to relocate. And we all know the history of the United States and the Trail of Tears. In Alaska, the federal government forced the Unungan people on the Aleutian Chain to relocate during World War II, and 10% of the population died. So when I talk about the work that we do, I now describe it. So one of the critical things that we're doing is decolonizing the systems that have caused the tribes that we work with to be in environmentally vulnerable places. In Alaska, the places where tribes are living now are places that the federal government chose because the federal government forced Indigenous tribes to send their children to school. And the barges dumped the construction materials at the places where they could dump the construction materials for those schools, and basically forced communities to become sedentary when they used to be migrate to their fishing camps or their interior for hunting grounds. So human rights is critically important to visioning what I call a relocation governance framework. So it doesn't exist in the United States. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And so the work that we're doing with the tribes is visioning what does a relocation governance framework look like that's based in human rights. And the most important human right is the right to self-determination. So what we know from the government mandated relocations where the people forcibly relocated had no decision-making power and suffered horribly is tribes and others forced to move because of the climate crisis, their right to make all of the decisions about where to go, when to go, how to go, they need to be making these decisions. And the science, right, the climate science needs to be in service of those decisions so that communities and tribes get access to the information that they need to make these really, really excruciatingly difficult decisions.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciated in your testimony that's also in the book is the emphasis on any measures that we might take to adapt to or to mitigate climate change or to mitigate the impacts on a community, for example. Those measures also have to make sure that they take into account and protect human rights standards.
Yes, well, human rights have to be the foundation of how we respond, and also decolonization and de-vetting racism. I mean, I think it's those three core principles have to be the foundation of how we vision our collective future, because we've all seen what the pandemic has caused and the gross inequities around the world in regard to how the pandemic has played out. And if we're not paying attention and advocating to make sure that human rights are front and center, then the climate crisis is going to exacerbate those existing inequities.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So let's take this substantive human rights notion a little further with John Knox. Can you come on, John? Let me introduce. John is a Lowerman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University Law School. And where I learned about you, John, was that you served the first 2 terms as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So your introductory essay during the tribunal, and it's included here in the book, Bearing Witness, was titled And in the book, it's titled Human Rights and Climate Change, Where Are We Now? And that was in 2018. So where we were then and where we are now 3 years later is different. So there've been some changes, and I'm curious what you would say are some of the major developments in the last few years.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks and congratulations to you and Kathleen and all the other people who worked in this book and all the work you did to put this case before the tribunal. This is really a great achievement for all of you. You should be very proud of it. There have been so many important developments in the last 3 years in the development of human rights law and its application to climate change that it's hard to just mention a few, but I'll just focus on the way that human rights are increasingly providing a basis for successful climate litigation in many different countries around the world. And I'll just mention 3 or 4 cases if I can briefly. So in 2018, the same year that this case was decided, in Colombia, a group of children and youth won a case before the Colombian Supreme Court in which the court ordered the government to take steps to protect the Amazon in order to protect the human rights of the plaintiffs. The next year in the Netherlands, the Dutch Supreme Court decided Urgenda v. Netherlands, in which it held that in order to protect its citizens from the effects of climate change on their rights to life and to private and family life, the government of the Netherlands had to phase out greenhouse gases more quickly, and in particular reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 25% by the end of 2020. And lest you think these cases have no effect, even when they're decided in favor of the plaintiffs, the Dutch government pretty quickly announced measures that included huge cuts to coal use, limits on livestock herds to cut methane emissions. So this was a real success story. Another case, Robin was just talking about climate displaced people. Last year, in 2020, the Human Rights Committee, which oversees compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, issued the first climate migrant decision, a case involving a man who was resisting being sent back from New Zealand to his home in Kiribati on Tarawa Island. And while the committee said that in this case, New Zealand could send him back, the committee also made clear that in the future, they were likely going to be deciding cases differently, because unless things change, sending people back to islands that are like the people, the indigenous peoples of Alaska and the Arctic that Robin was talking about, the small island state inhabitants are facing really an existential crisis. And in a few years, the Human Rights Committee suggests it won't be possible, consistent with human rights law, to send people back to these places. One last case, if I can mention, it was just decided last week by the highest constitutional court of Germany. That case involved language in the German constitution that protect the rights to life and integrity, as Kathleen was discussing, but also essentially the rights of future generations. And the Supreme Court of that case, the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany, held that the plaintiffs, again, youth and children, basically their rights had to be protected as members of the future generation, that is, that would be alive beyond 2030. And that Germany had to do more, not only to commit to reducing greenhouse gases by 2030, but to do so in a way that didn't disproportionately affect the rights of children and youth by pushing too much of the burden off on them. So there's really been a lot of exciting developments. And in that context, the Permanent People Tribunal's decision should be seen in the light of this kind of growing and evolving jurisprudence of human rights and climate change.
Yeah, geez, thank you. Those are, heartening. They raise your spirits a little bit. There are clearly lots of other ways, other approaches to take on climate change. It could be regulatory approaches or statutory law. But this human rights approach is, new-ish. I don't know how many years you'd suggest it's been going on, 10, maybe less than 10. What do you see as the main advantages of that human rights approach to climate? And what challenges does it present?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is newish. I think you can probably trace it back 15 years to the first case brought to an international body, which was brought by the Inuit Circumpolar Council in 2005 to the Inter-American Commission, but that case was not successful. And so the first successful cases are much more recent than that, but they show that you have to start, right? You have to start making these arguments and then kind of work your way towards making them successfully. I think the main advantages of the human rights-based approach to addressing the climate crisis, the climate breakdown, include, in no particular order, the fact that it puts front and center those who are most harmed by the effects of the climate breakdown. We see that many of these cases, for example, are brought by, people like the Inuit or people from small island states or children and youth. I mean, William Gibson, the science fiction author, has been quoted as saying that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And the future of climate change is already here, but it's unevenly distributed. Some places are already experiencing what others will be experiencing later. Human rights gives you a way of talking about that. And that's crucially important. The second major thing that I think a rights-based approach does is that it opens up new forums that wouldn't otherwise be open. So it not only gives you a language to use, but it also gives you an audience for that language in the form of domestic, national, regional, and international courts and tribunals that are increasingly willing to hear these cases. But it also opens up other forums, such as the Human Rights Council that appointed me, as you said, Tom, in 2012 to be the first UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. It's now considering, or being pushed to consider, I should say, whether to appoint a human rights and climate change special rapporteur, which I think would be great. I don't want to overstate the success, how successful any of these approaches can be. As you said, they can't really substitute for political will or for the necessary regulatory changes that are going to have to take place. And in particular, I'm pessimistic that a rights-based approach through the courts is going to be very effective in China or the United States, which are, of course, the two largest current emitters. And indeed, the case brought in the United States, most famously the Juliana case, has not been successful. But having said all that, I want to end on an optimistic note here. I think the overarching benefit of putting the climate crisis into the context of human rights is that it gives us the right standards to apply to the problem and to possible solutions to it. That is, that states, that businesses, multinational corporations, that all of us have to adopt solutions that ensure that both current and future generations can live in a world that enables us to live lives of dignity, freedom, and equality. That's what human rights is here to ensure, and that's what we need to face the climate crisis.
Yeah. Geez, thank you. Thank you. So you mentioned things that human rights opens up things we can do, steps we can take. And so I guess that's the next piece of what we want to raise here. Is that right, Kathy?
Yeah, we thought that it would not be really fair to end this conversation with these people who are so eloquent about what needs to be done without some conversation about what the people who are listening can do. So let me just start, okay, Tom?
Yeah.
People ask me, what can one person do? My answer always is, stop being one person. Pick up the phone. There are millions of people out there doing the work of saving the world. Find your cause, find your choir, find your courage, pick up the phone. Joanna Macy says, you don't have to do everything. Do what calls your heart. Effective action comes from love. It is unstoppable, and it is enough. So the question is, what do you love too much to lose? What do you love too much to trade away for cheap gas? The answer to that question will tell you what your cause is And then that cause can direct you to other people who can help you find your choir. So that's one piece of advice. What you got, Tom?
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I like the way Kelsey Juliana says what you just said. When she's asked this question, what can people do? Her answer is three things: show up, say yes, and bring your magic. I think that nails it. And one new development that I want to plug here is youth climate courts. This is a new project where young people can just simply designate themselves as a youth climate court and can then put on trial their local government, their city or their county government, on charges of not protecting their human rights with respect to the climate crisis. And so with a youth judge and youth prosecutor and youth jury members, they hold a court publicly and decide whether this city or county is guilty. And if it is, the youth court issues mandates to this city, like you have to formally declare a climate emergency right now, and you have to develop a science-based, human rights respecting climate action plan over the next, by such and such a date, and report back to us. And when we get your proposed climate action plan, if we think it's adequate, we'll say okay. And if we don't, we'll send it back to you to do a better job. So I think kids, by kids, I mean anybody in their teens up to mid-20s, climate generation basically, are the ones who have moral authority on this stuff now. Adults just don't, because, I'm not sure why it is, but young people are recognized as having moral authority on this. So these are just some ways that a person who's concerned about this can bear witness. That's what this book is asking people to do, is come and bear witness. And these are what we've mentioned here are some ways that people can bear witness. I forgot to mention the website for youth climate courts is youthclimatecourts.org.
Well, that should be easy enough to remember. Yeah, it's a really good idea. And I understand that some of them are in the planning stages or maybe already underway. That's great, all around the world. So I guess I get the last word tonight, do I, Tom?
Yes, you do.
All right, then. Why should we try? Sandra Steingraber says that we're all members of a great human orchestra, and it's now time to play the Save the World Symphony. You don't have to play a solo, but you have to know what instrument you hold and find your place in the score. But that's not quite right, is it? Because there is no score and there's no conductor. This isn't a symphony. This is improvisational jazz. This is improvisational jazz, lots of it, with all of the energy of improvisation and the freedom and joy of creativity unleashed. So I'm told that there are only really 3 guidelines for improvisational jazz. First of all, learn the key. I think that's probably a pretty good idea. Agree on the key. And then listen. Listen really hard. Third, then play with all your heart. So in this jazz improv, we can be the great rising wave, to use the Buddhist imagery. We can be the gong and the clanging cymbals. We can be the roaring lion. We can bear witness. We can make visible the invisible. We can call wrongdoers to account. We can give voice to those who have no voice. Future generations, small children, plants and animals, and the poor around the world, what Pope Francis calls the silent voices screaming up to heaven. We're making this up as we go along, and that's the delight of it. We can tell the story of a new world where rights are fully honored and where rights are fully enforced. We can imagine how quickly the fossil fuel industry will collapse under the dead weight of its own iniquity. We can imagine a world in which the ideal of justice is the driving force in the change toward a greener, cleaner, quieter, healthier, and fairer way of life. So listen. There are great jazz bands of committed people playing out there, countless numbers of them. And listen, you can hear this beautiful, powerful voices, this call and response in 100 languages, the roar of action advancing around the world. I believe that each of us will emerge full-throated from the dark shelter of our private despair, and we will find our courage, we will find our clarity, we will find our choir. Then nothing can distract us, not television, not shopping, not even composting. Our voices are now in the streets, in the state houses, in the college quad, at public meetings, and especially in the courtrooms, telling the truth about what is a betrayal of basic human decency, and telling the truth about what is worthy of us as human beings on this life-graced planet. This is what it means to bear witness. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for
Thank
care.
you.